Welcome back. We're picking up William Bradford's history of Plymouth Plantation in the first book, the first chapter. And he goes back to the very foundations of what was happening when the group began to gather in England long before they sailed across the Atlantic. And he remembers the coming together and the falling apart of the first groups. He says this: "These people became two distinct bodies or churches, and in regard of distance of place did congregate severally." So he's talking about Puritans and separatists, but specifically among the separatists, how they were spread out in different places in England. "For they were of sundry towns and villages, some in Nottinghamshire, some of Lincolnshire, some of Yorkshire, where they bordered nearest together. In one of these churches, besides others of note, was Mr. John Smith, a man of able gifts and a good preacher, who afterwards was chosen their pastor. But these afterward, falling into some errors in the Low Countries, there, for the most part, buried themselves and their names. But in this other church, which must be the subject of our discourse, besides other worthy men, was Mr. Richard Clifton, a grave and reverend preacher, who by his pains and diligence had done much good, and under God had been a means of conversion for many. And also that famous and worthy man, Mr. John Robinson, who afterwards was their pastor for many years, till the Lord took him away by death. Also, Mr. William Brewster, a reverend man. A reverend man, who afterwards was chosen an elder of the church and lived with them till old age." I got stuck there turning the page. Sorry about that. "But after these things, they could not long continue in any peaceable condition, but were hunted and persecuted on every side, so as their former afflictions were but as flea bitings in comparison of those which now came upon them. For some were taken and clapped up in prison, others had their houses beset and watched night and day, and hardly escaped their hands. And the most were fain to fly and leave their houses and habitations, and the means of their livelihood. Yet these and many other sharper things, which afterward befell them, were no other than they looked for, and therefore were the better prepared to bear them by the assistance of God's grace and Spirit. Yet, seeing themselves thus molested, and that there was no hope of their continuance there, by a joint consent they resolved to go into the Low Countries, where they heard was freedom of religion for all men. As also how sundry from London and other parts of the land had been exiled and persecuted for the same cause, and were gone thither, and lived at Amsterdam, and in other places of the land. So, after they had continued together about a year, and kept their meetings every Sabbath in one place or other, exercising the worship of God amongst themselves, notwithstanding all the diligence and malice of their adversaries, they seeing that they could no longer continue in this condition, they resolved to get over into Holland as they could, which was in the years 1607 and 1608, of which more at large in the next chapter. So since he stops there, we'll do the same.